valued viewers. I hope you are all doing very well. This video covers the fascinating story of the Virginia Railroad and its last locomotive, the 2666 Blue Ridge, sister of the Allegheny locomotive. And I want to start out by saying that the Virginia Railroad is not very unlike the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range Railroad in a couple few ways, and I'll describe those here now. So like the Mesabi, the Virginian was relatively late to the game as far as railroads starting, and it started operations in 1907. It was headed by oil tycoon Henry Rogers, and the railroad was simply built from the ground up. It didn't have a backstory full of business failings and mergers and reorganizations, name changes, or any of that. It was just simply financed and built from the ground up. So in 1898, Rogers meets William Page, who was attempting to build the Deepwater Railroad. And basically, this is where the Virginia story begins, because Page was an accomplished engineer, but he didn't have the money to get the dream off the ground of building a railroad. And Page wanted to get into coal hauling that ran on a line along the Kanawha River. And that area was heavily controlled by the Norfolk and Western and Chesapeake and Ohio railroads, and they were thwarting Page's every attempt at making any kind of railroad, a short line or any kind of railroad through that area. And as I mentioned in the Pennsylvania T1 video, that area was highly contested among several railroads, whether it be the Norfolk and Western, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the B&O Railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and even the New York Central to some extent. So once Henry Rogers gets involved, he just dumps $50 million of his own money into the railroad project, and off they went. They just built the railroad and didn't give two hoots about the Norfolk and Western or the C&O or anyone. And his new Virginian Railroad had one sole purpose and one purpose only, and that was to move coal. They didn't care about connecting cities and whatnot for passenger service. And that's another way that it kind of resembles how the Duluth, Mesabi, and Iron Range came into existence right around that same time period. And the Mesabi focused on a similar thing, only rather than coal hauling, it was iron hauling. And the Virginia Road was basically planned very smartly in that the steepest grade was just over 2% along any of its routes. So very smartly planned as well. Some of the key towns that the Virginia established service into was Beckley, West Virginia, Mullins, and they even dared to establish service in Roanoke, which is a stronghold of the Norfolk and Western. And from there, they continued the main line from Deepwater, Virginia to Norfolk, Virginia, and that line opened in 1909. And Virginia spared no expense as far as the quality of track and whatnot that was used to lay these lines, so they had extremely high standards. And any train running from West Virginia into Norfolk was literally traveled entirely downhill, which is, again, just very smart. And in total, the entire length or entire mileage of the trackage laid by the Virginia was 422 miles. And in short, the Virginia Railroad was simply a major thorn in the Norfolk and Western side business-wise. So much so that the Norfolk and Western bought out the Virginian in 1959 at a premium price. In other words, above market price, just to be done with them. And so they could just have control of everything in that region. And one lesser known fact about the Virginia Railway was the fact that its electrification of its tracks were the longest stretch of mountainous electrification in the eastern United States, even over the Pennsylvania Railroad. That project began in 1922 and was completed in just 3 years, and it cost $15 million, which is a huge sum for that time frame. The electrified main line ran 134 miles from Mullins, West Virginia to Roanoke, Virginia, again, Norfolk and Western Territory. And by this time, alternating current had been available, and that's what they used. And the electrified locomotive was the Westinghouse box cab 1DD wheel arrangement, and the first one of those arrived in 1925. And another lesser known note about the Virginian surrounded its 2666 Blue Ridge locomotive, which is a near copy of the Allegheny locomotive built for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad by Lima. And I'll touch on that in just a moment. So the Virginia and the Chesapeake and Ohio were the only two railroads to have built the 2666 Allegheny type locomotive. Obviously, the Chesapeake and Ohio was called the Allegheny, and the Virginia called theirs the Blue Ridge. And basically, the Virginia wanted them because they realized, like many other railroads, that they were short on motive power, and they need some serious hauling ability since their primary bill-paying freight was coal. So they had to have some really amped-up locomotives to pull what they needed to support the war effort. So the Virginia bought 8 of the Allegheny-type locomotives and once again called them the Blue Ridge. They took delivery from them from the Lima Locomotive Works between March and June of 1945. And these locomotives, these Blue Ridges, were called Class AG and assigned locomotive numbers 900 through 907. There were some minor variances in difference between the Blue Ridge and the Allegheny locomotives. The first one was that the Blue Ridge had smaller SAM domes and also a raised tender deck. The firebox and combustion chamber in these locomotives were simply huge, man. They were 162 square feet to the heating surface area. And unfortunately, the Blue Ridge only had a 10-year operating life. All were retired by 1955, and all of them, unfortunately, were scrapped in 1960. None of the Blue Ridge locomotives were retained for display or anything like that. So as I mentioned earlier, the Virginia was actually in the middle of the squabble between the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and the Lima Locomotive Works concerning the weight on the Alleghenies. Apparently, it became well known by some senior managers at the Chesapeake and Ohio that the Alleghenies were considerably overweight, which Lima had severely underreported the weight, which caused pay issues with the Chesapeake and Ohio's work crews. And to go a little bit further on that, apparently these senior managers didn't start to raise any questions with Lima because they were trying to cover up that fact between the two companies and failed. So how the Virginia Railway came into play in all this was the president of the Virginia Railway, Frank Beale, was a former high-level person working at this Chesapeake and Ohio, and he knew what the Allegheny was supposed to weigh. So when he got the specifications from Lima for his Blue Ridge locomotives version of the Alleghenies, he couldn't figure out why they weigh considerably more, and one thing led to another, and next thing you know, the CNO was forced to start asking questions of Lima, and that led to the major lawsuit against the Lima Locomotive Works, which started the end of that company. And it should be noted here as a final note that the total engine weight of the 1942 Alleghenies was 18,000 pounds heavier than the Virginian's Blue Ridge. So with that, the following specifications apply to the Virginia Railway's 2666 Blue Ridge locomotive built by Lima Locomotive Works. The drivers were 67 inches. The boiler pressure was 260 pounds per square inch. Tractive effort was at light 110,211 pounds. Factor of adhesion was an astounding 4.49. The cylinders were all high pressure at 22.5 inches by 33 inches. The locomotive's total weight, including the tender, was 1,195,000 pounds. The total weight on the drivers was 495,000 pounds. The valve gear was Baker valve gears, and the locomotive had Timken roller bearings mounted throughout. The firebox area was 762 square feet. The grade area was 135.30 square feet. And the railroad classification was AG. And with that, I'll wrap up the video, and I will say thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed today's content, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and turn on all of your notifications. And if you can, please help our efforts with the channel by visiting our print shop at Nickel Plate Limited on Etsy.com. Thank you once again.